Hello again. So take seat rapidly. We are going to start rapidly because the round table is somewhat shorter to make it to allow Alice Ruffo to say a closing word before catching a train urgently because she has to go to Paris rapidly. So we have to close. We have to close at 10:02, so we got an hour and 20 minutes, which is good. It's important because I think we should have time for to really go deep into the problems. And on this roundtable, we're going to talk about the power confrontations, this region. And we've been talking about this, for today. So this is at the heart. And the three main powers, even if their size is not, it's Russia, Russia, China, US, and we got experts in these three powers and their game in the Middle East. And we thought it'd be interesting to have sort of counterpoint views of Arab countries in not following these power confrontations or power games. So well, in alphabetical order, Igor Delanoë there, who is the deputy director of the Franco-Russian Observatory in Moscow since 2015. He has a PhD in history. He is an expert in geopolitics of Russia on the presence of Russian interest in the Black Sea, Mediterranean, the Middle East. So he's right at the core of a topic, and especially for specific focus, and well documented on the Navy, war Navy. Now, then Maya Kandel is also a historian, a researcher, independent. She's associate to Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3. She's an expert in transatlantic relationship. She was director of the United States program at the Montaigne Institute in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, in the Institute for Strategic Research in the Military Academy. And she has a bimensual chronic for Mediapart. And she wrote The US and the World in Perrin in 2018. And she got a blog called Prognostics that you can follow. Emmanuel Lincot is a French university professor and consultant. He's a specialist on China. He wrote China and this is Land of Islam, and a book which was published yesterday, actually, available, called Central Asia versus Beijing. And I'm sure for those who were at the roundtable of Marie-France Chatin on the Red Sea, Suez Canal and the Red Sea, Camille, who is associate researcher on the European Council for, she works on the foreign policy of Gulf countries, the Gulf-China relationship, Gulf-Asia, and the geopolitics of Red Sea. So you understood that Camille is here to give us the viewpoint from the Arab countries, or population. Be interesting to establish a difference because it's a real topic versus, the confrontations of the three big powers, three major powers. I'll go straight into the topic because, well, we discussed the problems of power struggles and powers, for the last 2 days. You're well knowledgeable in this topic. So for once, we'll start from the specific to general. And specific is the war between the Hamas and Israel. And the question I'm putting to the representatives of the three powers, if I can say so, is the war changing the situation for the strategy of each country, or is it more an accelerator of their strategy? And we could start with the US, and Maya, you have the floor. Okay. Thank you, Pascal. It's most interesting for the US because let me start with a short story. A few days before, 2 weeks before the terrorist attack of October 7, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in the US, talked in a conference in Washington, and he said, well, being happy about it, he said Middle East is calmer than it has ever been since for several years now, versus my predecessors for 20 years. Don't have much time to spend on this region. It was kind of a misquote. But again, you know, another interesting point that he had just finished an article on the basis, the objective of the American power for the magazine Foreign Affairs, and it will answer your question. But I'm not drifting away. But the printed version in the magazine was already out. But of course, the online version comes as some modification, amendment, because of what happened on October 7th. And this is, I'll try to answer the question. But in fact, what we see is that it doesn't change much. It doesn't change anything. To do a bit of a zooming out on this point, as you know, Joe Biden represents the third U.S. administration which tries to pull out of the Middle East, you know, to take some distance from the Middle East, because the U.S. want to concentrate on the main challenge they face, which is China and the Pacific. And it's very strange. When we read the article, we can see that well, on the one hand, the Biden administration was building on Trump heritage, while building the Abraham Agreement. But, well, it was the major diplomatic initiative of the Biden administration in the region. Well, it had to be some kind of cherry on the cake, you know, with the Abraham Agreement, you know, and complete the normalization of Israel in the region with recognition from Saudi Arabia, with the idea that in exchange, the U.S. were going to offer some kind of a safety guarantee to Riyadh. Of course, all this seems is reshuffled, you know, because of the war going on between Israel and the Hamas and all the consequences it causes. You know, and my colleagues, I'm sure, will discuss that. But in reality, when we look at the updating of this article, or the Middle East is still in the part which is called pick your battles, you know, choose your battles, you know, pick your battles. And the idea is that the U.S. have limited resources, and therefore they do not want to be involved again too much in the region. The problem being that well, I'll finish on that. On the one hand, the military system of the U.S. in the region of more than 40,000 people in about 10 countries did not change much, and it is some kind of increasing a bit in view of the current conflict. And plus, this philosophy of the Biden administration built on the Trump heritage with a bit of Obama, well, suffers from the same contradiction as the one of Obama. That is, the U.S. want to put more energy in the Middle East, and they hope to dictate, influence the players in the region. And there is a strong paradox, which the U.S. did not integrate the fact that in the new international relation, well, each country has more offerings to influences and sponsors, and the parameter that is not integrated enough in the U.S. foreign policy. I'll stop now. Okay, we'll do successive touches. We want to get more about the dual vision of the U.S. We'll do it in a second step. Talking about the U.S., we'll go to China after, you know, even though it is not yet as present physically in the region, but we know that China is always moving on mast. And well, the same question for China, Emmanuel. Well, it is a great opportunity for China, as it is an opportunity for Russia, because they don't have to talk about the Uyghurs. You know, the Chinese narrative and the conjecture, the context is more favorable. It's one way as well, quite revealing to for China to unveil what was said. High Chinese pragmatism together with Chinese ambivalences as usual, and in that respect, China is back to the restoring link with the Palestinian players. Well, there was, you know, a game between Beijing and Moscow. You know, China always selected Yasser Arafat in the 70s, you know, and the diplomatic relationship between Israel and China were established only in 1992. That is the year between Maynard and Beijing. So I would say, to conclude, Riyadh and Beijing. And it is a double opportunity because it makes it possible to keep the US on the second front. So you got Ukraine on one hand and Palestine on the other. And this to possibly dedicate themselves fully, we never know, to the Taiwan issue, which for the US and the China remains a priority. And third player, Moscow. Igor. Thank you, Pascal. Well, I'd say that what does it change for Russia at this stage? Well, not much, in fact, at this stage. And let's press it, it's a great opportunity for Russia for several reasons. First, it's just been said, the theory of the second front. Since the 24th of February 2022, there was a concern in Moscow that the second front would open against the Russian interest. They were looking at Moldavia because of weird things were taking place with Transnistria, and then we looked at South Caucasian, High Karabakh, and the Russians pulled out of it in a very realpolitik, cynical way. But the Russians were watching, looking for potentials, possible destabilization efforts. But it is not the way it took place. It went on the other side. That is, it opened up on the support to Ukraine, which ended up worried. We end up being very worried and about the situation in the Middle East, with all the media projectors will all of a sudden put their light not so much on what happens in Ukraine, but now by the hour about what happens in the. So the context is not, by chance. You know, the timing in terms of Moscow, the timing is pretty good. Outside, you know, they come out of summer and the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And even according to the Ukrainian chief of staff, it's been a failure. He published an article in The Economist, whereas observers, experts, followed the counteroffensive, by the day. Since the beginning of June, we understood that it was not doing, they were not doing very well. So now it's, it is publicly expressed and said that it is a failure. And in parallel, there is some kind of a natural lassitude within the public opinions. They have been bombarded with special news, breaking news, and so on and so forth for months and weeks on this topic. And of course, this is taking place. And we talked about the states, but all this, of course, takes place during a discussion in the US on how to complete the budget 2024. We find repair, a little. Otherwise, we'll have to find a situation, in the US, that we'll end up with an administrative shutdown. So this kind of rebalancing the priorities, they don't change them. They rebalance here. Ukraine, how much? 60 billion, 21 billion. Now we say, okay, priority, well, according to the speakers, is Israel, 14 billion. Ukraine, we won't put it in the same envelope. Well, Democrats, yes, you have to be put in the same envelope or scope. Well, Ukraine is a topic for domestic policy in the US, which is never good. Of course, there is another point which, in my opinion, helps Russia, is the double standard to, which comes out strongly and which resonates. The Gaza crisis is perceived as a double standard from countries of the South, at least from the Middle East. They look at Gaza, what goes on in Gaza, what goes on in Ukraine since February, and clearly there is a difference of handling of the news, by the West. So to conclude on this first question, well, anyway, for Russia, well, I don't think they should escalate the situation. Russia don't want the situation to get worse, and they don't want to have a regionalization of the conflict with the Hezbollah, simply because it is highly exposed because of its position in Syria, and it would be difficult to reinforce that if the situation were to degenerate with the implication of new players. Thank you very much. Now, it'd be interesting now to see how we stay in this logic. We do it's on the spot. Well, as a reaction to this positioning of the major powers in view of this event, so how the governments or Arab populations, if they have to make, if there is a need to make a difference, how do they react? Thank you. Well, it's always difficult to talk about Arab countries as if it was like a solid bloc. They have differences, especially in their relationship with major external powers. Within the framework of the Gaza conflict, there is unanimity among the Arab countries. The awakening of the Palestinian cause, which leads to mobilization of populations throughout the Middle East, which is highly emotional, and which had been seen possibly in Washington as some cause which was declining of a lesser importance, but this it is back to the foreground. So the Arab street and the Arab leaders, well, priority for the time being is on the regional stakes, even the domestic stakes and issues, of the leaders of the region, more than the international issues. But there are international stakes, and especially the way external powers take position, and especially the war in Gaza is feeding a discourse which was already present in the region of global order, which is evolving. The U.S. leadership is declining, and this vision of an opposition between global order dominated by the U.S. and the West, and the emergence of a global South, in which some Arab powers try to take a position. So this is a narrative which is pushed by Russia and China, and many countries of the regions are very sensitive to that, and especially the issue of double standards and the sort of bias of the West when it comes to international law, and it receives a lot of echo in the Middle East, and the Western pressures put on some countries of the region, especially the Gulf countries, to align themselves on the Western position in Ukraine, and which is some kind of, regenerating this notion of double standard. Now, does it change fundamentally the dynamics in progress? I don't think so. I think it is extending dynamics that were already in progress, especially, I might talk later on about that later on, but the diversification of a relationship of some countries of the region with new power, China, Russia. And another element which is important and where it doesn't change the situation, but the American power and the role of the U.S. in the region is that even if the role of the states is highly criticized right now in the region because of this current conflict, well, eventually the U.S. remain the only power that is capable to project military might in a significantly in the region. There's been a lot of discussion in the last years about the China. Will China become a player in the region? Well, China is actually pulling back there. It's on the background. So, and even if there is disagreement on the American position, we're back to fundamentals for the weight of American security in the region. That's important, and especially Saudi Arabia as negotiation in progress with the U.S. on the potential normalization with Israel and guarantees reinforced with Israel, and possibly a green light on their nuclear program. So even if the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is somewhat challenged because it's not the right time, well, it doesn't change the calculation of Saudi Arabia and their will to keep negotiating with the U.S. So safety guarantee reinforced there, and Israel will remain a key player in the region, and with which it will be necessary to on which it will be necessary to rely. So I can see in the countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, they were already looking elsewhere to rebalance. So there is a country which is on the other side, which is different in this, the Qatar, which is always original in the way it manages its power struggles, especially with the major powers. Now, in your opinion, will Qatar, well, is Qatar going to adapt its policies? Because the events could actually increase its popularity in the U.S., if I could say so. Could they take advantage of this original position, which to reinforce their original discourse vis-à-vis Iran and the Emirates? So how do you, in this game, or in this confrontation with the regime with the U.S., what could be the role and the card to be played by Qatar? Well, it's not just Qatar, actually. All countries of the Gulf are somewhat trying to see how they could take a stand in the region, either as a mediator or as a player of regional key interlocutors for external countries, especially for the U.S. But no, I think Qatar clearly is playing its role in the conflict, which is to use the relationship it entertains with the Hamas to stand at the center and be the key interlocutor for the negotiation. They already played a key role in the relationship with Afghanistan, and so it's always something that Qatar, well, the Qatar always, bet on that, and it is something which is, paying, positive for this country, and this, of course, annoys the other countries of the Gulf who would love to play a similar role. But we can see that Saudi Arabia will welcome soon summit of Arab countries and the OIC major regional summit on these issues. So each country, each Gulf power tries to take a stand, a position, and to play a role as key players. I'd like to come back to the US, of course, because, pick your battle, but at the same time, the US are coming back, even though they're not enthusiastic, but they're coming back nevertheless. The crisis is linked to a lack of political commitment in the Palestinian issue for, the Americans, they thought they would solve the problem differently. Now back to, well, I'd like to widen this. Now, this crisis, is it going to change? Could it change the posture of the U.S. in a significant way in the region? Therefore, then it would have to reassess its posture vis-à-vis China in this. Is it going to change the position, the cursor? Could we expect a stronger involvement over longer term with a real plan, strategic reorganization of Washington in this region? Well, difficult to have clear-cut opinions right now because everything moves very rapidly. So to answer simply, I don't think it is challenging the change to the shift to Asia. I don't think the U.S. would like to be re-involved more in the Middle East. But there are 2 points that I forgot earlier on, and I want to mention them. Well, the Biden administration was building on the capitalizing on Trump heritage, but had corrected the position, had delivered material to the Palestinian Authority, and there was again between intra-Palestinian, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. But the other point about the current priority is, of course, is to avoid conflict with Iran. Open conflict with Iran. There were several signals sent. Neither Iran nor the Hezbollah, nor the US, nor Israel wish to have a regional escalation. So, of course, well, clearly, I mean, this agreement is quite reassuring. But what I'm looking at, based on the evolution on site, is at one stage, strategic priorities from the US and Israel will diverge. And that Israel is as a sort of a maximal position which could go against the orientation of the states. Moreover, the Biden administration had wanted to launch another diplomatic initiative, which was that they would restore the discrete communication chain with Iran. In September, there's been Washington had unfrozen, well, had really 6 billion versus the release of prisoners. So things were moving in this domain. And of course, the funds have been refrozen by Qatar, by the way. This is something that goes through Qatar. So the problem is that, as I was saying earlier on, the Biden administration hoped that, and even Palestine could become a problem for the regional players. The problem is that no player wants it in the region except Iran, which sees the potential of mobilization of the Palestinian cause, and Iran. But, Camille will talk about that. But, well, this is the other question that unite the States, by the opinions of the region. I have other reactions, but I'm shifting away from the question. Sorry, I'm drifting away from your question, so sorry. So it was about the link with Ukraine that Igor mentioned earlier on. Well, a link which is done by the Biden administration, and you need to understand it at 2 levels. First, there is a tactical level, which is in the budgetary request vis-à-vis the Congress, and so internal policy. And the idea is to say, okay, the Ukrainian dossier support to Ukraine divides the party, but the support to Ukraine divides the Democrats. So the Republicans on one side, the Democrats on the other side. So new support by the budget and avoid the shutdown. Possibly there will be neither one, but the deadline is November 17th. Then after that, of course, there is a much more strategic level, which is international, which could be summarized by simplifying on the global battle of information, the question of double standard. For Biden, this is something more deeper, that he said it again and again in the national strategy paper. He said that in a speech 10 days ago, the point of inflection, and I think it's interesting because I think it is true, intuitively, there is something that is being played at the global level, but it holds true for the US, for the evolution of the US with this presidential election in 1 year time. But we'll come back to this in the last question. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come back to China. There could be 2 logics. China could fuel the problem because it's quite a big stone in the shoe of its major rival. But at the same time, China traditionally is more in favor of stability because it's good for business, especially in this region where there is a true energy challenge for China or stake. I'm sure there are the 2 options, possible options in the mind of the Chinese leaders. How do you
China is comforted in its position in the dominated dialectic. As you recall, justly, China, besides Russia, is promoting a new international order. This was mentioned at the BRICS summit or at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation meeting in Samarkand. So while being extremely smart, like the Japanese, it's not exclusively Chinese, but it was, and it consisted in not qualifying Hamas as a terrorist organization. It's a way, that's how I see things personally, to short circuit the claims towards or against China that could come from India regarding the real support to terrorist factions in Pakistan. So these are really, this is tricky, but it's a reality. And so we pull out of the Middle East to consider strategic aspects that transcend all the geographic regions. So for China, the priority of Xi Jinping, it's true for the Near East or all the other regions, is the project of the new Silk Roads. So there's a whatever it costs concept here with regarding this Silk Road project, even though they decided to simmer down on that. And we'll go back on this probably with a view to the Chinese internal policy. But China is not doing well. It's not doing well. But in any case, it doesn't mean that Xi Jinping will abandon the project of the Silk Roads. More so, since the war in Ukraine changes the railroad project of which consists in connecting the northwest of China, the province of Xinjiang, through the Federation of Russia, through Belarus and Ukraine, to reach the EU, which is the first economic power in the world, remember, and the first commercial partner of China. So what do we do? How do we create alternatives to this trunk, which is actually frozen? The railroad bit is frozen. We create different corridors, the Chinese, Burma, China, Pakistan, and the missing link is the Caucasianism, that is Azerbaijan, and the connections with Iran, Turkey, to run through another railroad, a median railroad, or eventually pipelines. And on that, China is ambivalent. It's in its strategic cultural DNA. What China does is what we observe for other regional actors, i.e. decoupling between the strategic stakes and the economic stakes. So we mentioned Qatar. Qatar is a case study. You know, the biggest American military base located in Qatar. We know that Qatar, for historical reasons, has very close relationships with Iran, but also with China. And it's the same for the Emirates, who would be about ready to open up a Chinese military base that would be added to that of Djibouti and eventually, potentially, of Gwadar on the Pakistan coastlines. So it's this decoupling that is interesting. So between you and me, it's no big deal, but we denounce the occupations, Israeli settlements of the Palestinian territories, because this serves the rhetoric of the global South, dominated by the dominant economies and countries. But we maintain the relationship with Israel, and why not the allies of Israel in the region I mentioned just now, in the Caucasian region, and notably Azerbaijan, which is essential and has a military cooperation with Israel, which is obvious, and there's no question for China to alienate Israel. It's vital. For example, the manufacturing of drones and very sensitive area. So they want to keep their relationship with Israel. So China benefits from this situation and maintains its ambivalence. Thank you. So for the two big players, it's in their interest that things are resolved, not making noise. And now we're talking about the third player. Is it more global? Its position towards China and the U.S. in this region, can it be shake up things? No, I don't think that Russia, we're talking about Russia, it's not its interest to make things worse or to see the situation degenerate. As far as the perception from Moscow, today you can imagine that the main concern for the Kremlin is Ukraine, and it's where all the military economic efforts are concentrated, with of course other initiatives over other horizons. We can go back on that, but all the crises that appear and that will continue to appear all over the world are perceived from Moscow through the prism of its confrontation with the North Atlantic community, which is embodied by the war in Ukraine. So what's happening in Gaza today is also read through this prism. So to what extent this conflict can serve or do the opposite, we can analyze certain situations that can hinder, that can eventually block the European competitors and Western competitors. So on the global strategy of Russia, hasn't changed much since Putin came to power in the Kremlin. The aim of the game is to recover the power of Russia, the sovereignty. And you need to know how to interpret the power struggles. It's questioning the Western domination, and that's something that appeared 23 years ago. Since with the Medvedev parentheses, but it wasn't. So they question the norms, the standards, the military, the values, and everything. And this is well embedded in the project. It's a discourse that promotes a multipolarity. An old speech that came back to Primakov, dates back to Primakov in the year 2000, practically inaudible in the Middle East and Africa. And elsewhere, because Russia was considered a bit as a bizarre player. But things have changed a lot since the 2010. Discourse now is well received, more than it did a few years ago. On the regional strategy, again, I don't think it will give rise to major changes. Mediterranean and North Africa, the Middle East regions, are zones considered by the Russians like regions where you project power, statutes, you project stability. The presence of the Russian fleet, 10 ships, 10 vessels, contributes to the stability of the region, according to Moscow and to the Kremlin. Things consider this differently, but this will continue. The region, North Africa, MENA, Mediterranean, give more strategic depth to Russia since the 24th of February, especially within the scope of the Ukrainian war. And Russia embodies a potential as a diplomatic mediator in the Middle East. It has this capacity to talk to everybody, particularly true in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Russia is a member of the International Quartet, and it's the only actor to be able to discuss with all the factions, Palestinian factions, the Hamas, for example. Hamas is not on the list considered as terrorist organizations by Russia. So they talk to Hamas. They are for the two-state solution, like Georges Malbruno said. Maybe it's a dream, but it's a wishful thought, but they are for that solution. Regarding the capital that was raised earlier, Russia said that it was ready to consider Jerusalem as the capital of the Israeli state, as long as East Jerusalem would be the capital of Palestine. But for the moment, Tel Aviv remains the capital of Israel. But in my opinion, they are aware of its possibilities. They're not capable of buying peace as the U.S. did between Israel and Egypt with billions of dollars. It has to channel its efforts in achieving a union, Palestinian union. You know, the Palestinians are very much divided, and consequently, Moscow discreetly meets the leaders who spend 3-4 days discussing, trying to make them converge towards a common position. So this is not on the agenda, but the efforts of the Russian diplomacy were focused on that, trying to bring all the parties together. But I think it's not very realistic given the tensions on the field. But in my opinion, I think Russia can still succeed with these discussions. Igor, when you look at the priorities you mentioned, Russia with Ukraine and the struggle against the West and making the European front more fragile. Objectively, if things deteriorate in Palestine, it's rather good news for Russia. And if the Arab populations and countries have to drop Israel, the U.S., Europe, and if the feeling is bad, it's to the benefit of Moscow. Don't we have here reason for putting oil on the fire? You know, it's like no. Hatred, the level of hatred is big in the region, so the Russians don't have to do much on that standpoint. But the only limit, I think, in this, in what you describe is, and I would agree with you on that, with your reasoning, is that they will not go up to creating an antagonism with Israel. It's not in their interest. There are, the declarations of posture, which are hard against Israel, but nevertheless, when you read between the lines and you look at the official declaration, there's no will to break the relationship or call back the ambassadors like it was done in Bahrain by Israel or other countries of the region. No, that's not on the agenda. But obviously, insofar as it doesn't overspill and it doesn't create a ramping up of the situation, like with Erdogan is very harsh and everything. So the degradation of the relationship between Russia and Turkey is good news for the Russians. The Americans made a lot of efforts in diplomacy for 10 years to try to reconcile these two countries. They managed, and a few months later, boom, it explodes, and of course, Erdogan plays his cards. It's good for the Russians. They don't need to do anything. It just happens. They don't have to do anything. So now we've understood that the population is unanimous, and it makes a lot of pressure on the states. Now, what I'm interested in is the position of the Arab decision makers. So this game between the U.S. and China, in which Russia plays a role to defend its interests. So how is that perceived? How does it fit in with the equation? Can it have a concrete impact on the choices that will be made in the months to come? On the specific conflict, or more general? No, on the positioning of each of the states towards the two big players, like China and the U.S., and then Russia. Well, in countries of the Middle East, again, it varies a lot in the region, because there are some states in the region, notably in the Gulf countries, who would like to become regional powers, and they look at the relationship with outside powers, differently. Some have very strong relationships with strong ties with the U.S. They depend on the umbrella, and others less. So it varies in the region. So we can make a distinction. I would say, generally speaking, that there are countries which pay a lot of attention on the transformations of the power struggles, between the two superpowers. There was a region which was for a long time under the domination, or very close to Western powers, and the U.S. for all. If it was North Africa, they were closer to Europe. The Middle East were closer to the U.S. And for some countries like Israel, Jordan, the Gulf countries, they were actually dependent on the security umbrella, U.S. security umbrella. And even for these countries who are dependent of the security guarantee by the U.S., there are some worries as to the concerns and the decline of the interest of the U.S. for the region. And notably, this pivot towards the India-Pacific region, even though the U.S., they repeat all the time that they're not leaving the Middle East, that they're staying there. There's the withdrawal from Afghanistan recently under complicated conditions, to say the least, and also in 2019, the refusal by President Trump to intervene after Iranian attacks against critical energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So this really hit the imaginary of a lot of people. And in response to that, the strategy of some of these countries was to diversify their relationships with a series of countries, notably to invest in their relationship with powers like Russia and China. And China in particular appears like an opportunity for a lot of countries in the region, notably with the scope of this diversification of partnerships, and also for economic reasons. For a lot of countries in the region, when the Chinese Silk Roads was launched, or project, they had hoped that it would lead to investments and economic outlets, especially for Middle East countries who find it hard to attract Western investments. As far as the countries who export hydrocarbons, the Gulf countries, for example, there's a major geoeconomic stake, which is at play. The center of gravity of the world energy markets has shifted towards China with the energy transition ideas, and the U.S. has become practically autonomous energy-wise with gas, and the European demand is on the decline. The demand from countries like Japan, Korea, even though it's still high, is also on the decline. And besides that, China has become, in the recent years, the first world importer of oil products, the first client of the Gulf countries. And so the CEO of Aramco, the Saudi oil company, declared 2 years ago that China would be the absolute priority of Saudi Aramco in the 50 next years, because China will stay one of the top importers of oil for the coming decades. India will start to catch up, but China will definitely be a key importer or client. And for them, there's a major stake. The access to the Chinese market is a major stake for their future prosperity, but also a political stake, because oil is the geopolitical lever for the Gulf countries, and that's what's at the heart of the transformation with the relationship with the U.S. This relationship has long been based on the nexus, oil against security umbrella. But this is questioned today, because there's a separation between the economic interests, which are on the Chinese side, and the security interests, which are still strongly on the American side. And so that's ongoing, very important. And this said, there are debates that are interesting to follow in the Gulf, the steering clear from the dollar, and that's related to that. And that have reemerged with the Ukrainian crisis. During the Ukrainian crisis, the West took measures or sanctions, unprecedented sanctions against Russia, setting a ceiling on the oil prices, which in the Gulf were perceived as, a dangerous precedent because it was perceived as an intervention by the Western countries on the energy market, and it gave rise to a lot of question on the dependency of to the dollar of these countries, and on the question of limiting their dependency to the dollar, eventually promote exchanges in other currencies. China pushed to have transactions in yuan, and so there's an ongoing reflection that's quite important within these countries, very present in the Gulf countries, but also in the rest of the region. And last point, they also use their relationship with the other powers like Russia and China as an exchange token, with the objective of maximizing their leeway, maneuver. And often China was used as an exchange token when countries of the region were criticized by Europe or the US on the human rights issues. Often China was pushed forward, and the relationship with China was highlighted then. One of the countries that is there one of the countries there that is original in a way? Maybe all the Gulf countries. Anyway, is there one of the Gulf countries that plays its cards differently, or is it about roughly the same strategy? Well, they all have their specificity and their positioning. The Emirates were particularly recent in the last years, developed their relationship with China quite strongly, and they try to be very flexible in their alliances with the different powers. You mentioned rumors of Chinese military bases that really formed a red line for the U.S. and the Emirates, that is, and the relationship between Emirates and China, which blocked the F-35 deal, aircraft deal, when the transfer was blocked because of those rumors of Chinese military bases, and also because of the presence of Chinese technology in the digital infrastructure of the Emirates. So the Emirates was quite proactive towards China, but all the countries like Saudi Arabia, because of its economic weight and demographic weight, all have their specificities to that effect. Thank you. Thank you. So these three countries all have a significant internal objectives. And the question I want to ask the three of you now is, to what extent do these internal projects can impact their strategies, and notably their strategy with the Middle East and the U.S.? Maya. I just wanted to go back on one element quickly. The attacks of the 7th of October had a big, gave us a big reaction. It was a big shift for Washington. That was February 2022, with the complete invasion of Ukraine by Russia, preceded by this announcement of an unlimited partnership between China and Russia. Important to go back on that, because to speak in a nutshell, it was the worst nightmare for the United States, something that is really considered seriously in the U.S. And there that really emphasized the fact that it had to be taken seriously. In Europe, we tend to say, yeah, but Russia is weaker, it won't last. But in the U.S., it's considered something very serious. Just look at the number of papers coming out of think tanks working on this since February 2022. So this has to be borne in mind. As far as the interior question, I mentioned that the Israeli-Palestinian element is something that divides the Democrats and the public opinion in the U.S. It's a complex question for Biden. Obviously, presidential elections is in a year, so it's a long time in politics. But the fact is, this ongoing war crystallizes more than a decade of vivid decisions in the U.S. left-wing and inside Democratic Party. And what is an issue, we see this in Congress, and we've seen this in the last weeks, and then U.S. cities and the campuses and everything, is that on that we see this divide between the more centrist pole, representing the establishment of the party. It's the position of both Joe Biden. It's the majority position in Congress that is on this indefectible support to Israel. And on the other hand, you have there's a generational divide. The younger progressists that we see in the elected representatives of Congress, they're still a minority in the Senate, but they're more and more powerful in Congress, is therefore a position that's more balanced of the U.S. between Israel and Palestine. Even for the Palestinians, it may sound like a caricature, but for the Palestinians, but there's nothing simple. I'm not trying to be simplistic. I mentioned that one of the most progressive, Jamal Bowman, is elected from the district that has the largest Jewish American population. So nothing simplistic here. American Jews vote for the Democrats at 70%, extremely progressive. But those who criticize Biden's line in the U.S. are the new generations, the new Democrats, the younger Democrats, those who are, again, for Black Lives Matters, very close to the Palestinian cause for a long time, since the 70s. I don't want to go back that far, but the Latin Americans and the future of the Democratic Party is at stake. And Biden, if the elections took place tomorrow, it doesn't mean that these people would vote on the foreign policies or on Israel or vote for Trump, but it could mean that they would stay home, vote with their feet. And all the recent elections, at very, very narrow margins or differences, 20,000 votes in Wisconsin ballots. It's an indirect system, so it's not the national surveys that you have to watch, but what happens in 4 or 5 swing states or key states. So you have a very important strategy to have, and this already is leading the Biden administration to change its position. Not only that, but there are some fights at the State Department. There was some people have quit or left their positions. They've resigned. It's a serious question. It's a very, but this case brings together the Republicans. Another interesting point is that we always say that the presidential election, foreign policies are of no importance. I think that this time, I don't think it was the case in 2016, 2020, because this question of the relationship with the world was very much present, not necessarily the most strategic aspect, but in the issue of trade, immigration. It's been an important dimension since the last 2 elections, and for my part, since it's my job to follow the primaries, the Republican primaries, they've started since August. We see the debates between the different candidates. The last debate, for 1 hour, they discussed foreign policies, something quite new, showing that there is a question that's important for the elections, and that will be taken into account because we are entering in an election year. Is that only a political game with evolutions, classic evolutions, or aren't we in the U.S. Witnessing major sociological change with one of the major Western countries, which was still impregnated with religion recently, which is slowly but surely entering in a cycle, the end of religion, which is culturally, intellectually changing its relationship with the world. Isn't this what we're witnessing now? So it's a heavy, very heavy trend that could potentially change the American posture with this rise. And what we're witnessing within the Democratic Party, isn't that the beginning of a big wave that could potentially change the American posture?
Well, there would be so many things to say on this topic, but no, you're right. But we do have an increase of the number of Americans who say that they're no longer affiliated to any affiliated with any religions, but it stirs fears in a minority of Americans for whom religion is still key. This is why the Republican Party with Trump, I'm not saying that he's exactly Christian religious or whatever, but anyway, he embraced the what we call the Christian nationalism cause strongly in the U.S. today, and most of the Trump electoral base are the evangelist Christians for whom there is an existential challenge within American society in terms of the role of religion in society. And today there is a speaker, a president of the Congress, who is clearly spearheading this, but so anyway, beyond that, I think there is something beyond this question of religion. The U.S. is a country that has changed deeply for the last 20 years, and one of the causes or one of the aspects, key aspects of this change is also the reaction of the U.S. following 9/11, this involvement, the two wars, disastrous wars that they conducted, and the country is still feeling the impact thereof. The explosion of gun violence, militias, is associated with the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of veterans, the loss of life expectancy in a country, in the US, it is the only Western country which has a lower life expectancy. I mean, Trump's election. So, in fact, the U.S. overreaction after 9/11, is still being felt in the U.S. It's still undergoing in this. So I see this as a country which is at a point of change for its own internal evolution, and therefore, of course, for the world, because the choice of the American role in the world will depend on this election and will have an impact on all of us. CIA publishes strategic reports, global threats. All part of it is public. And there have been several issues now when one of the major factors, one of the variables, is the U.S. domestic policy concerning the choice of the U.S. role in the world. And this increase of isolationism, which is today is progressing, is making headways in the Democrat side. It is a factor to be followed because this will have an impact on all of us. Thank you. So that's good news for China, I would say. But China has its own internal problems, Emmanuel. Yeah, but simply before answering this last question, well, I took China as an opportunistic power, almost in a caricature, but do not forget the fact that China is considered by the countries in the region as a force for proposal. Don't forget the real diplomatic success in the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran around the Yemenite conflict. So this is interesting. And somewhat China can afford to do so because it's it is a virgin country in the region. It doesn't have a colonial past like France or the UK or some sort of imperialism like the US. So this is one thing that must be borne in mind to understand the porosity of Arab countries or even Iran vis-à-vis the Chinese proposals. And in fact, be they the Arab country, Iran or Turkey, all will possibly adhere to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it is, I'm back to the question you're asking. That is the last one. That is, there is a form of Eurasian glacier which is being set up, and China would be the center thereof. Not to talk about sort of Ankara, Tehran, Islamabad, Beijing axis, but you know, well, clearly there is the blueprint of that. Now, to come back to the third question, so what about the impact of China foreign policy in the region versus the vis-à-vis the Chinese population? Well, none, because it's a dictatorship and the public opinion is just beautifully ignored. But you know, it's about what I see is that China is overdoing with proposals, you know, vis-à-vis Ukraine, so on and so forth. And I see maybe a sign of weakness. Foreign policy is strong when the domestic policy is weak. This is very schematic and theoretical, but I think there is something true. There is a bit of truth in that. Well, the economic conjuncture or context of China today is a bit of a disaster, and it's an understatement, because we know that in July, last July, the Ministry of Labor, or the equivalent in China, issued warning statistics. That is an unemployment rate of 25-35 or 20% in cities. So basically, statistics from a communist country are false. So they must be much higher, and certainly higher in rural environment. There is no employment in cities. Well, migrants for the Mingong, as we call them, well, remain in their countries, because there are no jobs in the city. So the situation is fairly dire for the regime. This is associated with sanitary policy, which was a disaster. The COVID-19 destroyed millions of jobs in China, millions of jobs in a country which there is no social public health, no retirement pension. You know, the situation is clearly worrying. And I do believe, again, that there is a separation between domestic policy, which is quite vulnerable, and the external policy, which seems to be firm, asserted. And with the risk, nevertheless, and I don't want to be paranoid, but clearly there is a reality which doesn't lie. Most of the hydrocarbons produced are in the Middle East. So this policy of a closer tie between China and the Middle East, you know, questions our own strategic interest. And also there is the monopoly of the exploitation at 80% of rare earth in the world by China. So the equation is simple. Hydrocarbon plus rare earth. If the China and Middle East, pro-Chinese Middle East, were to hold the two monopoles, you know, the West would face problems. Now, are we going that way? I don't know, but clearly in the Western foreign affairs offices, you know, we think about it. It was the declaration of Deng Xiaoping: Arabs have the petrol, the Chinese have the rare earth. So, get it? You get it? Now, what's more priority, I think, for Xi Jinping are the new Silk Roads, because for China, there's a need to create some kind of a meshing, which initially was a global project, which is becoming more and more, because of the context, some kind of Eurasian project. So, Russia Well, clearly, domestic situation not too good. So what's the impact on the external policy, foreign policy? Well, I think we'll remain with economic stability, the situation we all know with the stacking of US European sanctions against Russia for quite a while still, and stability within the regions. Well, economic stability, well, I think it refers us to the economic agenda that Russia has been developing with Middle East countries. It's accelerated since February 2022. You know, yeah, let's look at the evolution of the trade volumes between Russia and Middle East countries. You see big players, of course, obviously it's Turkey. A good year in the Russian-Turkish relationship for Ukraine was between 20 and 25 billion per year, with the balance, the trade balance was in excellent, you know, except for a few items. But anyway, last year it was more than 60 billion, more than twice, you know, 2022. So, which means that business is doing well between the two countries, you know. United Arab Emirates said it is the first Arabic partner of Russia, with Russia in the first economic partner for, and we can see the evolution of the trade balance, which is increasing. There's been no wrong step. Last year they did 9 billion of commercial or trade. 1 year ago, there was a 25% increase of the number of companies with Russian capitals in the United Arab Emirates. There are 10,000 of Russians who are now in the United Arab Emirates. There are immobilier, real estate investment in the by Russians. We know they want to buy for, you know. So it's first destination for real estate investment, even before Turkey. Turkey is a good destination. You know, they have a secondary, you know, the United Arab Emirates are clearly the hub in real estate for Russians in the region. It is an economic flag, sort of a spearhead. You know, Iran used to be the main economic partner. I'll spare you the details of the Russians, but when you accumulate the trade balance between Russia and the countries of the Gulf and Iran on the other side, well, it goes well beyond that of the between Russia and Iran for more than 10 years, and it's still ramping up. I mean, now the economic factor in the relationship between Russia and the Gulf country, it's quite heavy, and especially because of sanctions and so on and so forth. There is the dollarization issue, but it is a major topic of discussion between Russia and Iran. But that was said before, between Russia and Turkey, between Russia and countries of the region. But and more specifically for the Gulf, well, we talked about oil early on. There is a framework that structures the Saudi and Russian, the 2016 agreement, which well, they understood that they had to set a framework with visibility, especially for the Russian federal budget. Well, they have to see in terms of money because there is a battlefield and the expenditures are colossal. So oil is an issue of sovereignty. It's the first time that Russians are agreed to share a sovereignty element with a foreign country, the Saudi. And for human factor, well, there are elements which we have to first. Let me remind you that Russia, 146 million inhabitants, has about 26 million inhabitants, which is a lot. Russia is an observer to the Islamic Cooperation Organization for about 20 years. 25 millions of Russian Muslims is an endogenous Islam. Has been there for more than 1,000 years, especially in the southeast of Russia, in the Muslim Tatarstan, Chechnya, and sometimes the leaders of those regions, of Muslim regions, well, they are entrusted by the Kremlin to act as mediators with Muslim countries. There is a kind of, not a parallel, but complementary diplomacy, which can be deployed in the region. We've seen it in the last few years, and which takes place within framework of defined by the Kremlin. So this will continue. Having said that, within the framework of the crisis we see in Gaza, of course, there are limits. And of course, we see what happens in Marshkala a few days ago. The problems of Marshkala in the airport. Those are things that Moscow would like not to see, would rather not see. And the somewhat fiery declaration of such leader, Mr. Kazirov, not to mention his name, who are outside of this official framework of position of Russia. The Kazirov wanted to send the Chechen soldiers in Gaza. So, he says, I'm ready to send my men, Why would he do it? I don't know. But anyway, so clearly things like that are somewhat a bit stained. We saw it in the past with other context with the declaration of Kazirov which are against the official position of Russia. But anyway, for the time being, it is under control.
Thank you. We're going to conclude now with the targeted region. In light of all this, a difficult, Camille, but difficult task. We see that there are major economic interests that have been well detailed here. We see the Euro-Asia attraction towards China for the economic interest. That's where it happens in terms of security. The only involved in terms of protection is the U.S., the number one lever, and that's what they use in the present crisis. Security and the trends, the curves will cross. We see that in the U.S. there was a scenario quite realistic, disengagement, progressive disengagement for geopolitical reasons, and we also saw that the U.S. tend to have a lot more to be isolationist and try to synthesize. Now, as seen from Arab countries who take the same stock of the situation, what could they have in mind? What can there be in terms of new reactions in their positioning, prepare for plan B, just stand still, but there will be some security issues to cope with? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, I can't predict the future, but what we see, what's going on at the present time is that there's this question of diversifying relationships. The idea is not to choose one partner in particular. I think one important point is what these countries expect from Russia, from China, notably China, because it's one of the countries on which we've discussed a lot. Will China replace the U.S. as an important security actor in the region? I think that the countries of the region are more or less pragmatic on the role of China in the region. There are no expectations to see China playing the same role as the U.S. in terms of security. And you feel that there's an evolution in the perception, how China is perceived in the region. There have been some attempts when the Silk Road project was launched. We heard in the region, expression of hopes for investments, and also for the strengthen Chinese presence as an actor in the region. But in the end, year in, year out, the countries of the region reviewed their expectations in terms of investments. The Chinese promises were not always kept in all the countries of the region, and in terms of involvement in the security. Accordingly, the countries realized that China didn't have the will to play a major security role in the region. So the approach is really focused on diversification, maximize the margins of maneuver, use China to have more leeway in the negotiations with the U.S., and avoid being too dependent either of Russia or China on the other side. China, again, is also a competitor of some of the countries of the region, economically speaking. For the Gulf countries, it's also a competitor in a certain number of sectors, aluminum production, investments in ports and infrastructure in other regions. So there is a ambivalent relationship, which is marked by the diversification. There's a lack of trust also in what each of these powers can deliver in the region. And Russia, we talked about China, well, okay, but the love story that Igor was describing between Russia and the Emirates, is that something that's long-lasting, that can be structuring? Can Russia play the third man in this trio? Again, it's the Emirates, and again, more than the other countries in the region, they grab the opportunities when they present themselves. Today, with the crisis in Ukraine, they saw the very important economic opportunity, the reason for which other countries of the region, notably Saudi Arabia, did not really line up with the Western positions on against Russia. It's because in the case of OPEC Plus, they had to maintain their relationship with Russia in time. And so there are no expectations. They don't expect Russia to play a pivotal role in the region. But it's an actor that counts. And in the present context, they want to maximize the opportunities when they come up and to have form alliances that are as flexible as possible to adapt to the context. Thank you very much. I think we can talk about this for a long time, but it's, we have to stop. We're at the end of our meetings. So this debate really highlights the fact that this power struggle is really a negative game. It's because the Americans are stepping back a bit, that though the others are gaining weight. Often nobody wants to take the risk of burning oneself. So it's a kind, it's like a strategic barometer, and very unstable in situations because there's no true full-fledged leader. Nobody wants to raise his hand to be the leader. Everybody's sort of standing back because and the water's boiling because nobody wants to remove the cover. It seems that everybody's got the cold feet in there. And the future of the U.S. as an actor, will they continue to disengage, to pull out? But if it's the case, and if there's nobody really ready to replace them, then we can have a lot of surprises because we can let the local actors decide, but we don't know what's going to happen, and the worst can come. So I'm sorry, there's an announcement. They're inviting us to join to go to the second floor. Anyway, so I'll conclude with one word. Well, so I'll competition. Talk about competition. She's got the power. Okay, I'll finish with the last idea. Is the big strategic goal is the European Union, the EU, the European actors that are not capable or have the will to play a role to try to fill this hole. So thank you all. Thanks to the four of you. Thank you all.